Game design, as an art form, is prone to many pitfalls and imperfections that other art forms don't have to grapple with. While human subjectivity is a huge factor in the audience's enjoyment of non-interactive mediums, interactivity can introduce a far wider variance in the experience from player to player, making it harder for the designer to direct the experience in the same way the director of a film would. This variance means that unintentionality in a game's design is much more prevalent, opening up a more significant possibility for games to be unintentionally brilliant. You've probably heard this concept applied to games like Super Smash Bros. Melee, a Nintendo party game whose deeper mechanics accidentally created the gold standard for competitive viability in an entire fighting game subgenre, and a metagame that continues to evolve over 20 years after its release. Casual players won't see this potential, but the absence of that potential is what made the next two games in the series so controversial, despite Melee's competitive viability being largely unintentional in the eyes of the developers. Melee may be the best example of a game being unintentionally brilliant, but there's another example of this phenomena that is especially interesting to me, which is, of course, FEZ. The thing that pushes FEZ far beyond the sum of its parts into being one of my favorite games ever isn't necessarily a part of the game itself, but it was spurred on by the implementation of the game's most infamous puzzle, the monolith. After nearly 14 years, no one truly knows how this puzzle was meant to be solved, as its solution was brute forced within a week of the game's original release, and the developers have deliberately refused to comment any further on it. However, as part of an interview conducted for the game's 10th anniversary, FEZ's infamous lead developer Phil Fish said this about the monolith. The way they got around to solving it was way more interesting and satisfying than what we had originally intended for it. The monolith is one of the most enticing unsolved mysteries in any game ever, and it's an allure that's helped by the various other mysterious elements scattered throughout the game and its surrounding material, such as the concentric squares or the images hidden in the release of the game's official soundtrack. It created a community that continues to think and speculate about this one unsolvable puzzle to this day, but this quote implies that the single most important part of this entire equation, the brute force solution, was another example of unintentional brilliance. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that includes a piece from an entirely different puzzle, but it just so happens to fit flawlessly to create a perfect reflection of our need for answers to trivial yet burning questions. This is what drew me to research the development process of FEZ, which, aside from potentially providing insight into the mysteries of the finished product, is also just a very interesting story in itself. It's a story of perfectionist tendencies, extensive delays, legal disputes, and the inflammatory personality of one Phil Fish, all centered around the burgeoning indie scene of the late 2000s. This is the story I want to tell today, and along the way I'll be highlighting the most interesting pieces of the game's design that never fully made it to the public in playable form, which will hopefully give a better idea of how FEZ became the masterpiece we know today. This is a complete development history of FEZ. If you actively decided to watch this video, you probably know who Phil Fish is, if not as the creator of FEZ, then as the disgraced indie developer who would emotionally and publicly lash out at the tiniest criticisms from randoms on the internet. While discussion of some of his well-publicized outbursts is unavoidable when telling this story, we need to start from the beginning of Phil's life to understand how he even became one of the indie scene's first and most infamous public figures. Phil Fish was born in 1984 and raised in Quebec by his parents who passed their interest in video games down to him. Phil recalls getting the opportunity to play classic Nintendo games like Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, and Tetris as the moment he knew what he wanted to do with his future. It was also during these early years that his father would create simple games on an old Macintosh desktop, for which Phil would create the art. Even at the age of 4, Phil Fish was sure he wanted to make video games as a career, driving him to eventually study and graduate from a program for game design and digital art from the Montreal National Animation and Design Center in 2004. His first job in game development would be at Ubisoft, developing movie tie-in games, though this would be short-lived since he would later describe this as the worst experience of his life, and he would eventually be fired. While Phil would continue to work at larger companies, this is also around the time that he began to ingratiate himself into the relatively microscopic indie scene of the mid-2000s. Though formative indie games like Cave Story had been released at this time, the indie boom of the early 2010s that saw larger companies take notice of independent talent was still a ways off, and the games industry was still totally controlled by publishers and large development studios. Phil Fish saw the potential in indie games and video games as an art form very early on, and so he formed a group called Kokoromi alongside some of his industry peers he met through working at Ubisoft. Kokoromi would host a series of indie game events called Gamma, where developers would have to create games with certain limitations, such as a strict low output resolution or forcing the use of stereoscopic 3D visuals. His hand in organizing these events made him one of the more well-known figures within the tight-knit indie scene, and he would use that publicity to make an announcement in July of 2007. But first, I need to quickly introduce TigSource, short for the Independent Games Source. This site was once the premier online hub of indie game development and discussion, maintained by some notable names in the space like Derek Yu and Terry Kavanagh. What's important in this story are the TIG forums, the forum page for the site that hosts discussions about indie games by both developers and players interested in their work. If you were looking for someone to help with your project, or if you just wanted to discuss ideas about game development, these forums were and still do remain decently active to this day. At this early point, before the widespread adoption of sites like YouTube, the TIG forums were also a great place for developers to self-promote their own projects, which is done through creating a thread in the devlog section of the forums. You can find many notable indie games that publicize their development here, but we're here to talk about one in particular. On July 17, 2007, Phil Fish would start the devlog thread for FEZ on the TIG forums. This was the very start of development for the game, but he had already assembled 2 other collaborators to help work on the game. Renaud Bedard was the game's primary programmer, and he would see the project to its eventual release nearly 5 years later. Jason DeGrood, who also goes by 6955 online, composed music for the game at this early point. Of course, Disasterpeace would eventually take over and deliver one of the greatest soundtracks in video game history for FEZ, but the reason that substitution was necessary is a very important part of this story that will come up later. For now, Phil shared an image of the initial sprite work he had already made at this early point. This image does have some differences when compared to the art that would ship with the final game, such as Gomez lacking a mouth or the vase asset which didn't make it to the final release. But the general visual feel of the final playable version of FEZ is quite similar to what was seen here. While the onlookers were expressing their excitement for FEZ, Phil was answering questions about his plans for the project. Although a small prototype was done within a couple weeks of the thread's opening, the plan was to have a small but fully polished prototype for the annual Independent Games Festival that takes place alongside the Game Developers Conference. Since the next event took place in February of 2008, this gave the team until October to put their prototype together. One user voiced their hopes that the game would be out by 2010, which Phil agreed with, saying that he had no interest in making a game for that long. Phil was being deliberately selective in what info he was posting in his thread, which was almost exclusively information about the visual feel of the game, rather than any sort of gameplay. He had mentioned there was a twist to the gameplay that made the game unique next to its peers, but the audience would have to wait a few months for the first look at that twist, which would come with a teaser trailer on October 10th. Given the FEZ we know today, there's plenty about this trailer that's familiar, but much of it is just slightly off from the polished final release. First of all, the gameplay twist that defines FEZ was first seen in this trailer, and it has its own origin story. The basic idea of viewing a three-dimensional world from 4 distinct orthographic perspectives was not Phil's own, as the idea originally came from an indie developer from Toronto named Sean McGrath. It's not clear how much development on this idea was made between Sean and Phil, but they would amicably split from working with each other due to creative differences. Sean would go on to work on and eventually release a game called Dyad, while Phil would run with the 2D to 3D concept for FEZ. The way that the game's pixel art aesthetic would unexpectedly shift to reveal a three-dimensional world, and just as quickly return to the pixel-perfect presentation from a new perspective was immediately compelling. Some in the TIG forums noticed the similarities to two other games and their platforming gimmicks, Super Paper Mario and Crush, the latter of which was a much more niche game made for the PSP. Phil Fish would address this in a few different interviews in the next several months. In a written interview with Jason Rohrer, he would bluntly state that Super Paper Mario was a terrible game, and while he hadn't played Crush, he was confident in his ability to set FEZ apart from its contemporaries. He would also mention Crush again in an in-person interview with a publication called 1UP in early 2008.
Let's say, okay, I don't want to diss Crush, because obviously,
people are going to compare it.
Very similar mechanic.
Yeah.
But Crush had this weird artistic direction where it was in a world that was like dark and damp and not inviting at all. Like I didn't want to spend time in that world.
Right.
But I don't know, it wasn't a nice place to be in. I mean, if you're going to spend like 5, 6, or 10 or 20 hours in a game world,
right.
I want it to be a nice
Shouldn't
place.
it be nice?
Yeah. I mean, dark is gritty, is it's nice and all
place.
that, but I don't know, I like blue skies, green grass.
Right.
Bring back the blue skies.
right.
In addition to how the rotation mechanic is shown in the trailer, the immediately noticeable difference between this initial teaser and the final game is the additional vertical camera rotation, whereas the camera only rotates along the horizontal axis in the final game. This does make the 3D rendering tricks more obvious to the viewer, though it would be incompatible with a few of the puzzles found in the final game, since they rely on the floors being hidden from view for most of the game. There also appeared to be controls for moving the camera more freely in this prototype, though this was likely just another way of visualizing the perspective trick for demonstration purposes in the trailer. It's also important to note that Phil Fish was self-admittedly ignorant when it came to programming, so it fell to Renaud Bedard to make level authoring tools for the game that Phil could easily use. The art released up to this point made it clear that the game would be working off a grid-based system for terrain, though since the game was rendered using 3D models, it would need to be based off cubes rather than squares, increasing the complexity significantly. Ultimately, Renaud would create an editor called FEZer, built around extruding faces from existing geometry, with each cube being assigned a specific texture that Phil would create in Photoshop and import into the editor. Once the more complex geometry is constructed in the editor, the mesh gets automatically optimized by removing unnecessary triangles before being imported and rendered in the game. Renaud would call this system Trixels, which is a name that appears in this initial trailer as well as in the opening logos of the final release as the Trixel engine. The music of this era is also worth mentioning now, since the absence of Disaster Piece's score may feel uncanny to those familiar with FEZ today. Jason DeGroote's music heard in the trailer and in the 3-track EP he would release in 2009 containing his work for the game was significantly more stereotypical for an indie game at the time, though it's fallen out of favor somewhat over the years due to its overuse. Chiptune was very common as a musical style in indie development due to its nostalgic qualities and/or ease of creation. For the time being, the more familiar feel and cheerful tone of the chiptune style would fit the marketing materials, though it's unclear how much the shift in musical styles affected the trajectory of the game's development and vice versa. It's hard to imagine the contemplative exploration seen in the final game fitting alongside these upbeat chiptune tracks, but it's also hard to say how Jason's music would have evolved over the game's development, given there were only ever 3 tracks released from this era. While most in the TIG forum were enamored by the great presentation of the trailer, other onlookers were skeptical of the rotation mechanic's ability to create interesting gameplay. This is a criticism that arguably still applies to the final version of FEZ, which is that the rotation mechanic is very limited in its ability to make platforming and exploration interesting on its own. Usually, flipping through each of the 4 perspectives until you find a viable path forward is the best way to approach the game's platforming, which isn't especially conducive to interesting puzzle solving on its own. The final version of FEZ would instead focus on its secret input codes to keep the late game puzzles interesting, though the 2007 prototype would be fine simply because of its very short length. The charm of the visuals was plenty to make FEZ an interesting game for the time being, though this was the small-time beginnings of skepticism surrounding the game that would grow over time. This was all that could be gleaned from this short teaser trailer, but thanks to other sources, we have some idea of what other early concepts were being considered for FEZ at this time. There was once a website called Formspring that existed from late 2009 until 2013, which was a social network based on asking users questions on their personal pages. While the site doesn't exist today, the contents of Renaud Bedart's Formspring page have been archived, and they provide some interesting insights into the radically different game FEZ was planned to be at this early stage. One anonymous user asked about the story plans at this point in development, and Renaud confirmed that very little of the story seen in the final game was considered at this early stage, aside from the higher order alien civilization concept, which was apparently hinted at in these early builds. He also notes that the structure of exploration was planned to be very different from the style of open exploration seen in the final game. Instead, the game would be split up into levels similarly to the 3D Mario games, including a set number of cubes for each level, with one set aside for collecting 100 bits. Renaud also states that the vases seen in the trailer and previously in concept art could be picked up and broken to find bits, though once they shifted to only 8 bits per cube, this was deemed too tedious a process and was scrapped. Additionally, Phil had planned to introduce Metroidvania-styled power-ups that would be granted by obsidian cubes, though whether or not he planned for these to be obtained through more challenging puzzles like anti-cubes in the final game is unclear. Another, more well-known early concept for FEZ was this character, a dark version of Gomez seen in a few pieces of early concept art that Phil shared. Renaud claims that Phil called this character Ninja, who would have appeared in cutscenes throughout the game to hint at another, faster, more knowledgeable and alive character that is still exploring the world. Although it was an interesting concept, it was incompatible with the focus on lonely exploration the game would eventually take up by the time it released, and it was scrapped fairly early on because of this. At this point, Ninja is more well known for the uncanny, creepypasta-esque character design and its use in notable, almost certainly fan-made works like the videos of Owl Effigy. But for now, these were all just plans. The small prototype of the perspective rotation mechanic that was revealed in the trailer was the only tangible piece of FEZ that existed at this time, and it was deemed complete enough to be submitted to IGF 2008. Phil Fish planned to attend, of course, but he claims that he ran into issues with his industry job at the time, as they refused to give him the time off to attend the show in San Francisco. This finally motivated him to quit his job, leave the AAA industry altogether, and fully dedicate his time to working on FEZ. Phil later recounted this in a 2009 interview with Kotaku as the moment that he became indie, which is a quote that sounds kind of cringy today, but probably went way harder in 2009. FEZ was nominated for 2 awards at IGF 2008, Excellence in Visual Art and the Design Innovation Award. While the Design Innovation Award would go to World of Goo, FEZ had much more success in the Visual Art category.
And the winner of the IGF Art Award is FEZ.
In the clear blue sky, an awards ceremony. This is fucking awesome.
Winning this award did come with a monetary prize of $5,000, but what was more important was the publicity it gave the game and the motivation it gave the team. The game was receiving media coverage in the lead up to the awards ceremony, such as Edge magazine dedicating 2 pages in their February 2008 issue to an interview with Phil Fish and Heather Kelly talking about their work together in Kokoromi, which also mentioned FEZ since it was being developed under the Kokoromi name at the time. Other mentions came from mainstream gaming publications like Rock Paper Shotgun, sharing footage of a demo shared at IGF and contributing to the hype leading up to the awards ceremony. FEZ winning an award at the show was vindication to Phil for quitting his job, and it was, at least more than anything before it, an indicator that FEZ had legs as a commercial product. Off the back of this success, Phil was able to secure a grant from the Canadian government to help fund the game and the creation of the company that would develop it, Polytron. In the TIG forum thread on April 4th, 2008, Phil would confidently state that there will be no significant media update until the game is done, more or less a year from now. With the game's newfound success and funding, FEZ's future as an uncontroversial indie classic seemed secure. But of course, this wouldn't quite come to be. Before moving on with the timeline of events, we need to take a look at the demo of FEZ that was shown at IGF 2008, evidence of which exists today as a lightly edited 5-minute video that was publicly released around the time of the event. It's clear that this was a continuation of the work seen in the teaser trailer, with the same camera rotation motion and general art style being seen, but it had now been built out into a fully playable vertical slice, showcasing an introductory level. In contrast to the sense of importance the rotation ability is given in the final game's introductory sequence, rotation is somewhat comedically introduced in this demo through Geezer telling Gomez to shift perspective so he can read a sign. Of course, this was likely just a placeholder before any significant story beats were considered, though Geezer's broken English ended up making it all the way to the game's release. Another odd part of this demo is the presence of collectible FEZs found scattered around the level. The cubes and associated bits weren't implemented at this point, so the player would instead collect FEZs, which was a placeholder system using placeholder assets to make exploring the level a bit more interesting, according to Renaud. That being said, the level featured in the demo is very linear, with the majority of the FEZs existing directly in the linear path of progress, so it's definitely clear as to why the more abundant collectibles would be scrapped. The linear, vertical structure of the level was also addressed by Phil in the aforementioned IGF interview with 1UP, which he explained by contrasting his approach against Super Paper Mario's level design.
I mean, there's a reason why the level in FEZ are 100% vertical, because the rotation, right, it's always like about as wide as the screen. Whereas in Mario, they kept a horizontal, linear, classic Mario level, so when you rotate, it's just this big, boring, bland corridor.
Yeah, it's one block.
It's one block, and anytime you get to like an obstacle in the game, the solution to any puzzle is just press A. Oh, hey, there's a door, or oh, there's a cube there, or...
Although there would be exceptions to this rule found in the final game, the verticality of FEZ's levels would remain an important part of its design all the way up to its release, and it was being considered just a few months into its development. The rotation mechanic simply makes Gomez's horizontal movement capabilities too powerful, whereas climbing up can still challenge the player's decision-making in a much more interesting way when horizontal mobility is limited by the terrain. Another scrapped mechanic seen in the demo footage is shown when the player rotates in such a way that puts a chunk of terrain in front of Gomez, which simply displays Gomez as a silhouette in the final game until he moves out from behind it again. In the demo, this would instead freeze Gomez in place and force the camera to rotate back to the previous perspective. It's not hard to see why this mechanic was scrapped, as it adds unnecessary friction to the platforming of an otherwise relatively casual, relaxed experience. There are also points where the player can't reasonably tell if rotating the camera will place Gomez behind terrain, and while this would be just a minor inconvenience in most situations, the solution seen in the final game is simply much more intuitive and friendly towards the player. It's also worth mentioning the minor visual differences seen in the demo, since it gives much more info in this regard than the teaser trailer did. Generally, things are just lacking in the mere shine polish that the game's visuals would eventually reach by its release, including Gomez's animations being a bit more stiff, many tiles sporting a somewhat washed-out color palette, and the background sky texture being a bit more generic in terms of presentation. While Phil Fish was a talented artist, given his background in studying visual art, FEZ was his first attempt at making pixel art on this scale, and he similarly had no experience doing animation work either. The animation work for Gomez was actually outsourced to Graham Lackey, a user on the TIG forums who gave critiques of Phil's pixel art and eventually offered to help with animations, though his work didn't end up making it to the game's release. The tiny imperfections in the static pixel art would be smoothed out over time by Phil, though the work seen in the demo and various previews found in the TIG forum thread were still quite good, especially for the era. Though this is most of the cut features seen in the demo, there are other cut features from this time period that should be mentioned. For one, Renaud shared a concept of what he called bridge sections when he was asked about cut features on his Formspring, which would be a sort of intermission section where the camera would shift from the typical 4 perspectives and show a quasi-isometric perspective instead. This was cut alongside the free look feature seen in the teaser trailer and demo footage since it was too revealing of how the world was built. These two features would later inspire the first-person glasses seen in the final game, which ended up being an important part of several puzzles. Also mentioned in this response on Formspring are pressure plates. These would have been more similar to the floor buttons in the Portal games, in that Gomez could stand on or leave boxes on them to hold them down, but it was later decided to shift to buttons that can only be pressed down by the boxes, since they made for more interesting puzzles. This is most of what can be gleaned from available materials about this version of FEZ. barring a few very minor things here and there. The video of the IGF demo would be the last significant chunk of this version shown publicly, which appears to be the result of Phil Fish's shifting ideas about what FEZ should be by the time it would release. FEZ was about to undergo a soft development reset, and while the team would continue to use very similar aspects of presentation and moment-to-moment platforming gameplay, the macro structure of the gameplay and the world's design would be reconsidered significantly. This reset would mark the transition from 2008 FEZ to 2009 FEZ, which I'll be referring to as such since the new version would eventually be showcased privately at GDC 2009. While the exact time that this shift took place isn't entirely clear, since Phil had taken a break from posting teaser images in the TIG forum thread, there are some context clues elsewhere that point to this shift taking place in mid-2008. For instance, Renaud's answers to questions on his Formspring account make a distinction between 2008 and 2009 FEZ, with much of what was seen in the IGF 2008 demo falling under the umbrella of 2008 FEZ, and the later developments falling under 2009 FEZ. This already suggests mid-2008 as the soft reset point, but an additional clue in Renaud's Formspring answers is that the first mention of the Zooish alphabet in his emails with the team was in June 2008, which is a clear indicator of a shift in development priorities around that time. The development of FEZ was significantly more private following IGF 2008 when compared to the lead up to it, so we need to jump forward on the timeline to the very start of 2009 when a new source of information about FEZ was launched, the official Polytron website. This website came with a blog, which provided info about less important things like Polytron's merch store, but it's also where many big and small FEZ updates would be posted in the coming years. It's at this point that Polytron would publicly take over the development of FEZ, since the game was previously being developed under the Kokoromi branding. This is also the first mention of a specific release window for FEZ, as the blog's second post says, "Confident in its dedication to the project, Polytron projects a release in 2009. The Polytron blog would continue to post about FEZ over the next 2 weeks, showcasing early versions of what would become Villageville in the final game, as well as a showcase of the more polished sprite work that had been developed since the IGF demo. It was also announced that Polytron had hired Annabelle Kennedy to assist with animations, which was another member of the TIG forums who shared her well-regarded fan art of FEZ in 2008. Since she appears in the credits of the final game as an animator, it's safe to assume that at least some of her contributions made it past the finish line. This surge of teasers was released in the lead-up to GDC 2009, where FEZ was slated to appear as a private demo. Although this private demo was not recorded, we have various teaser images, small trailers, and footage of an internal build from late 2009 courtesy of Renaud Bedard to help understand what 2009 FEZ was like. As seen previously by the work-in-progress screenshot of Villageville, this is the point where world design concepts that are found in the final release were first implemented into the game, though there's still plenty of areas and a few cut gameplay concepts seen in the 2009 prototype and surrounding materials that didn't make it to the release. Most importantly, the 2009 prototype contains the general outline of the introductory sequence seen in the final game, though it's paced very differently and contains more explicit tutorialization in between Geezer's letter and the encounter with the hexahedron. Rather than simply climbing to the top of the village, this version had Gomez push a couch in Geezer's house, which led to an underground tutorial sequence. These tutorials covered pushing and throwing boxes, and the throwable bombs which both appear in the final game, though the tutorials themselves would be replaced by the character Dot in the final game, who reminds the player of these more specialized controls if asked. The more in-depth tutorials were likely seen as necessary, since movable objects like these were planned to be featured much more prevalently than they were in the final game. Regardless, these tutorials lead to a room that actually still exists in the files of the final game as an unused 2D texture, and jumping on the raised platform teleports Gomez to a room with the hexahedron. Oddly, after receiving the FEZ, the player has to solve a puzzle before the fake game crash, which actually did make it into the final game as one of the easier anti-cube puzzles. After returning to the village, the player has to find 4 cubes before they can leave, rather than just one as seen in the final game. It seems that bits were at least being considered at this time based on the HUD having an icon for them, but they don't appear to actually exist in this specific prototype. To those familiar with the version of Villageville seen in the final game, this expanded version may feel somewhat uncanny due to its size, but but this is actually because this version of the area vertically wraps, similarly to the giant Tetramino room found in the final game. This effect wasn't pulled off seamlessly in the final game, so it's no surprise that there are some odd rendering artifacts that presumably occur at the seam where the level loops on itself. Other than the vertical looping, the other differences between this version and the final version of the village seem to be owed to this being a prototype that lacks polish in various places. For instance, the interiors of the houses in the village are quite barren, and not in the deliberately dilapidated sense that the abandoned interiors in the final game are. These interiors were likely placeholders that stayed this way until more interesting props were made to decorate them, though some arguably carry more gameplay importance in this prototype since they hold entire cubes rather than just bits. Strangely, there are also bombs in this version of the village, and you are able to carry these bombs through room transitions in order to reach the same sort of obvious breakable walls seen in the final game. Once the player collects 4 cubes, the content found after the village is clearly very work in progress. 2 more rooms exist in this prototype, an early version of the main hub island with a non-functional warp gate, and a room showcasing the industrial zone's rotating platforms, which abruptly ends with a sign marking the end of this prototype. While this is the most complete snapshot of 2009 FEZ, there are a few other resources for information about this version, including a trailer made for GDC that was publicly posted on Polytron's blog on March 24, 2009. This trailer shows some other level elements that may look familiar, like the crush blocks that move towards each other when Gomez moves between them, as well as the black holes that appear across the game world over time. Also in this trailer is the first look at the sync room seen in the final game, though it's unclear whether or not the music was synced to the gameplay at this time. The presentation of this room is practically identical to its presentation in the final game, making it one of the earliest individual level concepts to make it all the way to the release alongside Villageville. Other concepts from 2009, once again, come from Renaud Bedard answering questions about the game's development. One of the more well-known pieces of unused content that was data mined from FEZ is the Satyr Cube, a reference to a notable 5-word Latin palindrome found in the ruins of Pompeii arranged in a square. This palindrome is written in the Zhuish language on 4 sides of a cube, with one unique letter missing on each side, O, R, N, and T. Rather than just being a fun Easter egg like most of the Zhuish writing in the final release, this Satyr Cube actually had a specific gameplay use as a save point. Renaud mentioned that this mid-room save feature was considered for longer rooms, though as the rooms found throughout the game were trimmed down to take a matter of minutes at most to traverse, it was seen as unnecessary since the game was already auto-saving on each room transition. Renaud also shared some videos of cut concepts from 2009, the first of which were called motor blocks. Each side of these blocks visible to the player would have an arrow on them, and the blocks would move slowly in the direction of the visible arrow. This allowed the player some limited control of how the blocks would move, but Renaud says they ended up being difficult to design interesting puzzles and exploration around. This concept is somewhat similar to the track platforms found in the final version of the Industrial Zone, though these platforms were made to be much more constrained by the level design to ensure the player had to engage with the intended challenge. The other notable cut concept from 2009 were called heavy groups, which were simply groups of tiles that would fall if there was nothing supporting them. These would be used in conjunction with bombs to remove the tiles beneath the heavy groups, which would allow the player to manipulate them. Much like these other cut concepts, heavy groups were cut simply due to the lack of interesting puzzles they enabled. Although it's clear that the game was making good progress towards a release at this time, FEZ would experience its first important, yet relatively insignificant controversy around the time of GDC 2009. On February 15th, this image was posted onto the Polytron website, hinting at the oncoming information that GDC would bring. There may not seem to be anything particularly concerning in this image at a glance, but it did show one detail that was not really discussed up to this point: a button prompt. Specifically, it was a button prompt for an Xbox controller, and this made many people on the TIG forums concerned that FEZ would be an Xbox exclusive. It's important to remember that Xbox Live Arcade was just beginning to incorporate more indie games around this time, with the enormous success of Braid in 2008, and Microsoft subsequently onboarding more indie developers like Edmund McMillan. While Phil would state that they weren't discussing release platforms at this time, it was announced several months later in July that FEZ would release on Xbox Live Arcade in early 2010, which was also a small delay compared to the 2009 release window given earlier that year. Though it wasn't explicitly an exclusive yet, the way this was indirectly communicated stirred up a bit of controversy for those in the TIG forum thread who didn't want to buy an entire console to play FEZ. Additionally, on September 9, 2009, Renaud posted onto the Polytron website celebrating the last 2 years of development, sharing many screenshots of development builds showing the progress that had been made. These screenshots aren't very revealing of any cut features, but this post is an important reminder of just how long FEZ was taking to develop. Fans of indie games in the modern day are well acclimated to waiting for small teams to build huge experiences through delays and long stretches of radio silence, but this was far from the norm in this early era. In an era where most indies existed as simple freeware games made as fun side projects, 2 years was an abnormally long development cycle for an indie game, which wasn't helped by Polytron consistently shifting the release date back as time went on. Phil Fish also wasn't being very forthcoming with the sense of scale he was aiming for with FEZ, and all these factors taken together caused many to become impatient. But unfortunately for those in the TIG forums who were eagerly awaiting the game's release, we're not even halfway through FEZ's development cycle yet, and the most tumultuous period of its development is still yet to come. This is the point at which the trajectory of FEZ's development in terms of design gets a little bit more muddy. The first half of 2010 came with a drought of publicity for the game, with only a brief post on the Polytron website in May confirming the game was still in development. This does seem to indicate another soft development reset, since Phil Fish has stated that they had 3 of these resets over the course of FEZ's development.
Yeah, this is basically FEZ 4 at this point. We've scrapped 3 games, and
Really, for real?
kind of, yeah. But I think we got it.
That's a bit of speculation, since it's unclear when exactly the latter 2 resets occurred, but the details on the design ideas for this intermediate version are scarce. While the details on the game itself would slow down at this time, there were very important events happening behind the scenes that would help to shape the public's perception of FEZ, and especially Phil Fish. Firstly, on May 18, 2010, a Kickstarter was launched for a documentary called Indie Game the Movie. This documentary would catalog the development and release of several indie games, with Team Meat and their game Super Meat Boy being the subject shown in the initial trailer for the film. According to the Kickstarter page, the directors Lisanne Paget and James Swirsky had already traveled and filmed their initial footage with several dev teams in early 2010, with Polytron and Phil Fish being among these initial subjects. The funding goals for Indie Game the Movie's Kickstarter were fulfilled quickly, and while the directors would use this funding to scope out more potential subjects, the story of FEZ's development would eventually end up as one of 3 cornerstones of the film, alongside Team Meat's Super Meat Boy and Jonathan Blow's Braid. Filming for the documentary would stretch into 2011, but there was another very important event in 2010 that would shake up FEZ's development dramatically. Jason DeGroot was still a part of Polytron as producer and composer for the game, but there were tensions brewing between him and Phil Fish. The specifics of this feud have been kept under wraps, as even Renaud Bedard claims to lack the full picture of what happened, but it was a serious enough problem for Jason to completely leave Polytron in the summer of 2010, requiring that the remaining team not use any of his existing work in the game. Jason would, ironically, go on to work with Sean McGrath, the developer who originally came up with the basic gameplay concept for FEZ, on his game Dyad. Polytron quickly found Brandon McCartan to handle sound design, and Renaud met with Rich Vreeland, aka Disasterpiece, at a live show in Montreal around the same time. Rich was immediately interested in doing the soundtrack for FEZ, with Renaud recalling that he only pitched the idea of scoring a single area, to which Rich responded, "Why not the whole game?" Phil loved the style of the demo tracks that Rich made, so he was quickly welcomed onto the team. While Polytron was able to recover from the loss of Jason DeGroot quickly, the tensions between Jason and Phil would have nearly disastrous consequences in the near future. It was also in the summer of 2010 that there was a new marketing push for FEZ, with Phil beginning to post on Polytron's website again. This started with a tongue-in-cheek celebration of FEZ's 15th anniversary in August, a nod to the game's current position in development hell, but also a signal that development may be back on track again. It's likely that, since Polytron had some fresh perspectives from their newest hires, this is around when the final soft development reset occurred. There are 2 clues that support this, the first being that Renaud claims the Zooish number system and the deeper focus on the game's secret puzzles was first discussed and developed during this summer, two very important parts of the FEZ we know today. But the clearer indication would be the oncoming flood of teasers that Phil would post every Friday on the Polytron blog starting in September, which contain screenshots that showcase areas approaching their final designs as seen in the release version. FEZ Fridays would continue up until December 17th, 2010, when it was announced that FEZ would release on Xbox Live Arcade in 2011 in a post that also confirmed Jason DeGroot's departure publicly. In the public eye, the development of FEZ was moving along smoothly, but there were major issues behind the scenes. The protracted, multi-phase development cycle of FEZ didn't seem to take much of a toll on the team's creativity, but it did take a major toll on Polytron's finances. Aside from the grant from the Canadian government, Polytron was receiving funding from a few different investors like the Indie Fund, though as development continued, they began to get more desperate, looking to borrow any small amount of money from friends and family to sustain the company. Polytron was slowly bleeding money with each missed release window, to the point where the team couldn't possibly sustain development stretching into late 2011. Phil made plans around this time to showcase a fully playable demo of the introductory section of FEZ at PAX East in March 2011, but in order to complete the game following this showcase, Polytron would need to receive significant additional funding from somewhere else. To compound these issues, Jason DeGroot's messy backstage departure had escalated since mid-2010, and Polytron was now facing potential legal issues that easily could have destroyed any chance of the game releasing if it escalated to a full-on lawsuit. This is the story told by Indie Game the Movie, with FEZ's eventual appearance at PAX and the diffusing of Jason and Phil's legal tensions serving as the climax of the film's coverage. Though Indie Game the Movie was well received upon its premiere, the film attracted one controversy over its portrayal, or lack thereof, of Jason DeGroot. Jason is never referred to by name in the film, as Phil only calls him his former business partner, and his image is always blurred when showing a photo of Jason and Phil together. One of the most alarming moments in the documentary is an interview with Phil Fish, expressing his mounting stress around Jason's separation from the company, and since they were both attending PAX East to show off their games, Phil was concerned his temper would cause him to do something drastic if he saw Jason that day.
And I'm having a panic attack about this. I feel like I'm gonna cry, throw up, and pass out all at once. My breathing is all weird. I'm gonna lose my shit. I'm gonna kill him. I'm gonna fucking murder that guy. And it's gonna get everybody in trouble. We're gonna get kicked out of PAX or some kind of horrible disaster like that. I can't even begin to figure out how I'm gonna handle this.
Of course, this is an extreme case of catastrophizing and obviously not a confession of premeditated murder, but it was also an expression of how serious the legal issues between Jason and Polytron were and how existentially threatening they were to FEZ. Jason was essentially cast as an antagonist in Indie Game the Movie that was threatening to destroy Phil Fish and Polytron's years of hard work on FEZ, an issue that was compounded by an error in the film's credits, which was meant to state that Jason was not asked to appear in the film, but in the initial release, the credits stated that he asked not to appear in the film. This prompted Sean McGrath to speak up for Jason on Twitter, calling Phil Fish and the filmmakers liars for how they portrayed the legal dispute and Jason's absence in the film. It didn't help that Phil's new business partner Ken Schachter was also a producer for Indie Game the Movie, which was easy to paint as a serious conflict of interest. People close to the film stated that the text in the credits was an honest mistake, with digital releases getting updated to change the text and make it clear that Jason DeGroot was not consulted in any way. This was enough to satisfy Sean and Jason, but it would be a stain on both Indie Game the Movie and Phil Fish's reputations going forward. FEZ's appearance at PAX East thankfully went off without any legal issues, and it even made a good first impression to those who played it, despite the demo build being plagued with technical issues, but none of that would matter if Polytron failed to secure any more funding. Phil later admitted that he was close to canceling the game in early 2011 simply due to the lack of money available to support development, but FEZ was saved from this fate by a nearby Canadian studio called Trapdoor. Trapdoor had just received funding from EA to publish their own game, and they offered to help Polytron fund the remainder of FEZ's development while only asking for a cut of the game's earnings rather than anything further like the intellectual property rights to FEZ. In a matter of days, Polytron had been saved from its two greatest existential threats, and in hindsight we can see the clear progress towards the final product that Polytron was making. The demo seen at PAX East showcased an intro sequence that is practically identical to what was seen in the final game, and other footage released around this time tells the same story of a game approaching its final form. But at this point, though it was clearer now that FEZ was much closer to releasing than ever before, it remained to be seen whether or not the game would live up to the hype it had built up over the last several years. Even though Polytron had avoided multiple disasters by March of 2011, pressure continued to build around FEZ releasing in a reasonable time frame. The appearance at PAX East and its later appearance at PAX Prime in August of 2011 generated a lot of press for the game, increasing the anticipation for its release even outside of indie circles like the TIG forums. FEZ was also part of the rapidly growing interest in indie games, spurred on by Xbox Live Arcade and Steam offering a much lower bar for entry by publishing through online distribution. If FEZ was successful and of high quality, it would be remembered as one of the greats of this formative era for indie games, alongside games like Braid, Super Meat Boy, and even games that didn't go through typical distribution services like Minecraft. Luckily, Phil Fish is a perfectionist. He was never going to allow FEZ to release until he was sure he had made the game he set out to make all the way back in 2007. Renaud Bedard went on the record stating that the reason the game was stuck in development hell for so long was a mix of Phil's perfectionist tendencies and his own lack of experience when starting the project. He claims that Phil seemed sure that 2009 and 2010 FEZ couldn't see the light of day regardless of how many deadlines were missed and how much investor money was burnt through, because those versions of FEZ weren't quite up to his standards yet. This philosophy had put FEZ in jeopardy in the past, but with Trapdoor's funding, those troubles seemed to be behind them. Now, it was simply a matter of living up to expectations. FEZ continued its marketing campaign through the TIG forums, the Polytron website, and Twitter, though there was another source of news for FEZ that I haven't mentioned up to this point. The Polytron Vimeo account would begin posting teasers for FEZ in late 2010, and Phil Fish found a new use for the account in 2011. He realized that, since they had essentially shown the first 10 or so minutes of the game in action through their appearances at PAX, simple screenshots wouldn't be nearly as interesting as they were previously. Instead, Phil would post a few long screenshots on the Polytron Vimeo page, which were videos that showcased the camera smoothly rotating around a stationary Gomez to show off the 3D environments. These videos were great pieces of marketing that showed off FEZ's excellent art direction and novel perspective tricks in a very compelling manner, which continued to push the anticipation of its release further. Alongside the second of the 3 long screenshots, FEZ's final delay announcement was made, pushing the game to early 2012. In terms of other reveals in 2011, this teaser image was the first mention of the game's map system. FEZ's map is a bit cumbersome in practice, but this teaser image that showed a very blurry view of the entire map really helped to give a sense of scale to the game that hadn't been seen up to this point. Interestingly, FEZ actually wasn't meant to have a map system originally. The non-Euclidean layout of the game's world didn't lend itself well to being mapped out in Euclidean space, but Phil Fish also wanted to call back to retro games like Zelda 1, where players would be encouraged to create their own physical maps in order to stay oriented while exploring the game's sprawling world. Microsoft was actually the party that initially proposed adding both the map and the tutorial character Dot to the game, since the lack of a map and general guidance was a drag on the more casual experience FEZ was going for, so both these features were implemented to give players a far better sense of direction. Seeing as how FEZ was nearing completion and gaining more traction every day, it was time for Phil Fish to return to the Independent Games Festival. FEZ was submitted to IGF for the second time in late 2011 for the 2012 show, which was a move that drew ire from some onlookers. FEZ's 2007 prototype had already won an award at IGF 2008, so why was it eligible to enter again? It's not as though Phil somehow deceived the runners of IGF. Submitting FEZ again was completely allowed within the rules, but this was more of a question of whether or not that rule was fair to other developers. This was made worse since a new rule for 2012 was that no finalists could resubmit, but this only applied to later shows for finalists after 2011, so many people interpreted this as FEZ only getting in on a technicality. Phil would later appeal to the Ship of Theseus in response to this debate, stating that so little of the foundation from 2007 exists in the version from 2011 that it was practically an entirely new game, which was absolutely true to some extent. A common compromise between these two points of view is that this was more of a logistical failing on IGF's part rather than a moral failing on Phil's part, and he shouldn't be shunned for submitting his game in a totally above-board manner, even if the rules were odd. Regardless of which side was most popular at the time, this incident would eventually be another contributor to what became of Phil's public image. Speaking of which, 2012 would be the beginning of Phil Fish as a proper public figure, which was spurred on by the premiere and later digital release of Indie Game the Movie. The documentary helped to bridge the gap between the still quite small indie game scene and a larger audience of both gamers and those who are just interested in films and documentaries. But even next to the exciting underdog story of Team Meat and the more philosophical musings brought by Jonathan Blow, Phil Fish was consistently cited as the film's most memorable star. It starts from the very first piece of interview footage shown with him, which puts his inflammatory personality on full display in response to the discussion of just how long the game was taking to release.
I'm working on it as hard as I can, all the time. It's like, what's taking so long? What the fuck are you doing, Phil? Like, I'm doing the best I can here. You know, Eco took 5 years to make. Red Dead Redemption, 1,000 people, 5 years. GTA 4, 1,000 people, 5 years. Nobody bitches about that. 1,000 people! There's 2 of us here. It's taking too long. Fuck off! Jesus fucking Christ! Like.
Though Phil's comments on Jason DeGroot leading up to PAX are quite alarming, his response to the question of what would you do if you couldn't finish the game may be even more alarming.
What would happen to you personally if you couldn't finish the game?
I would kill myself. I'm dead. I will kill myself. That's what that's like my incentive to finish it, is then I get to not kill myself.
Phil Fish's eccentricities made himself, and to a lesser extent FEZ itself, the standout storyline in an already well-received popular documentary. This brought a lot of attention to the game, which was also receiving attention from IGF in early 2012. FEZ had been nominated for 2 awards at IGF 2012, Technical Excellence and the Seamus McNally Grand Prize, the latter of which is essentially IGF's Indie Game of the Year award. The game's appearance at IGF 2012 ended up being something of a rehash of 2008, as it fell short of one award, but it ended up winning another.
And the Seamus McNally Grand Prize winner is FEZ.
Thank you so much. This means the world to me. 5 fucking years. I don't know what to say. Seriously? Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
At IGF 2012, Phil Fish and FEZ were crowned together as indie royalty, at least in the eyes of his peers in the indie scene. The wider audience, however, had a much different outlook on him. This perspective was shared by many before this point, but it would become much more prevalent following the infamous events of March 2012. 2 of Phil's most widely publicized controversies would happen in quick succession this month, though much of the fallout is hard to find in the modern day due to Phil having wiped his Twitter account for reasons we'll get to later. The first was almost entirely localized on Twitter, which was Phil taking the time to tell a random Twitter user who insulted him to choke on his dick after he won the grand prize at IGF. This would, unfortunately for Phil, become one of the most iconic things he's ever said. It became an immortal symbol of his tendency to feed the trolls, who are only looking for this exact kind of reaction, and it just made him look deeply unhappy on what should have been a night to celebrate a great success. Instead, this tweet made it look like his idea of celebrating was getting in dogfights with randoms on Twitter, which has never been a good look for anyone. However, the second, much larger controversy associated with IGF 2012 would occur following a screening of Indie Game the Movie at the festival, which was followed by a Q&A panel with the stars of the film. At one point, a Japanese man stood up to ask a question. He expressed his joy at seeing all the influence of classic Japanese games like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda in all 3 of the games featured in the documentary, and he wanted to know what the panel thought of modern Japanese games. In an impulsive move, Phil Fish grabbed the microphone across the table and said,
"They suck. I'm sorry. Like, you guys need to get with the times and make better interfaces and like update your technology. We're totally kicking your ass. Back then, you guys were the king of the world, but your time has passed. I'm so sorry."
This incident was chronicled in a short documentary provided as an extra for Indie Game the Movie's physical release, which includes Phil's retelling of the events and his reaction to the explosive aftermath. Immediately after this panel, Phil's comments on Japanese games spread across the internet to gaming news sources that ran articles publicizing it further, an effect which can be seen in the comments under the Polytron blog posts, which were immediately filled with angry replies about this incident. Although the claims that Phil was racist towards Japanese people were a bit more far-fetched, he definitely voiced his opinion in the most dismissive and inflammatory way possible that made it easy to read as mean-spirited and targeted. And for that, he deserved plenty of criticism, even though he and Jonathan Blow would go on to expand on his initial blunt statement. But what's more out of character in hindsight, considering what would happen in the next year, was Phil's reaction to the hate he was receiving.
I kind of like it. I mean, it's too bad that it's negative stuff, but I know a lot of people that say big, stupid things like that all the time, but people aren't listening. Just the fact that people are listening, even if they don't like me, they hate me. They follow me on Twitter just because they hate me, but they're listening, and they're talking about me.
But for now, we should get back to FEZ, which was going through the final certification process with Microsoft in early 2012. FEZ would receive its finalized, exact release date just a few weeks ahead of that release, and it would finally be playable exclusively on Xbox 360 on April 13th, 2012. As you probably already know, FEZ released as a huge commercial success for an indie game, but it was also a huge success in terms of game design and general artistry. The review embargo was lifted a couple days before the official release, and the reviews from major publications were glowing. It was praised for its incredibly unique artistic style, engaging collectathon exploration, and its deeper puzzles that kept engagement flowing even after reaching the game's conclusion. For the time being, Phil Fish had won. He finally managed to complete the game he wanted to make for the last 5 years, and that would reward him with generational wealth in the years to come. But rather than this being the start of a long, fruitful career in independent game development, it wouldn't take too long for Phil's reputation to catch up with him. The release of FEZ, Indie Game the Movie, and his widely publicized controversies were all a perfect storm that pushed Phil Fish to unforeseen levels of infamy. Some would see FEZ's massive success as a refutation to the trolls and haters who tried to keep his success down, though it was also hard to ignore Phil's tendency to end up in heated controversies. These wouldn't stop after FEZ's release, and they would eventually reach a tipping point. Despite this, the first controversy following the game's release would be one where it was reasonable to sympathize with Phil, as he was about to start a feud with Microsoft over their policy around patching games on Xbox Live Arcade. At the time that FEZ released, Microsoft's policy for submitting patches was that developers would get one free patch to clear up any lingering inconsistencies brought to light by the influx of players, but any subsequent patches would need to be put through a full certification process that the developers would have to pay thousands of dollars for. FEZ was criticized for being buggy at times upon its initial release, so Polytron used their free patch in June of 2012 to fix these issues. The only problem with this patch was that it caused save corruption upon installation in some very rare cases, with Phil estimating that it happened to less than 1% of the players who installed the patch. The discovery of this issue was enough for Polytron to revert the patch, but now they had used their free patch and would have to pay for certification in order to submit a new patch that fixed the save corruption issues. FEZ had already grossed over $1 million in the 2 months after its release, so Polytron could absolutely afford to pay for certification of a second patch, but Phil also pointed out that the save corruption bug will affect such a small minority of users that the price tag is unreasonable, and that they were already paying Microsoft a lot just to be published on Xbox Live Arcade. This led Phil to make the controversial decision to reinstate the existing patch in July, save corruption bug and all, and abandon any future support for FEZ on the Xbox 360. If you only play games on PC through services like Steam, which allows developers to patch their games whenever they like with no certification process, this policy may seem insane to you, but these sorts of rules are a lot more common in the realm of consoles. Companies like Microsoft sell their consoles with the implicit idea that they are far easier to set up and use without issue when compared to PCs. PC users are more accustomed to technical issues in their games that arise in part from the wide variation in hardware that PCs can have, But games on consoles shouldn't have this issue since they only have to run on one specific set of standardized hardware, which gives the manufacturer a much more vested interest in making sure the games available through their services are fully functional and bug-free. Developers can't reasonably find all the bugs in their game prior to a wide release, which is why Microsoft allowed one free patch to incorporate some playtesting from customers, while keeping later certifications expensive to discourage developers from releasing buggy games that they can just patch later. At the same time, the save corruption bug in FEZ was a tiny issue that required a tiny fix. The static nature of the certification fee and the one free patch policy that doesn't take into account how much the patch changes the game made the value proposition of making and submitting a new, insignificantly different patch seem insane to Phil, which is why he made the decision to leave the save corruption bug in the game and abandon Xbox Live Arcade. This is one of the more debatable controversies surrounding Phil Fish, but it didn't stop many from seeing him as a greedy, self-important indie snob who would knowingly ship unstable software before parting with any of his company's abundant income, all because of his own inflated ego. With the loss of Xbox support, Polytron began to look into porting FEZ to other platforms, which was officially announced on the Polytron blog at the tail end of 2012. The first of these platforms would be PC through both Steam and GOG, which was ironic considering Phil's infamous tweet stating that FEZ is a console game and PCs are for spreadsheets, another instance of his tendency to make pointlessly inflammatory statements. Although this tweet would convince some to boycott FEZ's PC release, the game was still a big success on PC, enough so that FEZ reached the landmark of 1 million sold copies by the end of 2013, though this figure is inflated somewhat by sales through Humble Bundle. But we do need to back up a bit to talk more about the events that led to the final crescendo of this entire story. Phil was still digging a deeper hole in his own reputation throughout the first half of 2013, with his Twitter threads expressing controversial opinions like, Let's Players should be forced to share their revenue with the developers of the games they play, still popping up occasionally. Even aside from those who disliked him for his overall personality, trolls who were only looking to post rage bait knew that Phil Fish was exceptionally predisposed to taking that bait, so he became a popular target during this period. Whether it was someone offering a genuine critique of his opinions or actions, or it was just someone attempting to get a reaction out of him, Phil just couldn't hold in his urge to fight back. That predisposition would get him into what would be his final argument, but before that, there was a very important announcement made in June of 2013. The Horizon Indie Game Press Conference was a side event connected to E3 in 2013, showcasing various indie games in development at the time in a similar way to the main E3 shows put on by huge publishers and studios. At the end of this conference, a surprise announcement was made that would significantly overshadow the rest of the games showcased there. Of course, FEZ 2 would never release, and not because of the same development issues that FEZ faced. Instead, it was cancelled a month later for reasons that were left somewhat unclear at the time, though most people attributed it, at least in part, to another high-profile Twitter beef that Phil Fish would enter with a games journalist called Marcus Beer. On a July episode of the Game Trailers podcast Invisible Walls, Marcus Beer touched on a recent announcement from Microsoft about the future of development for the upcoming Xbox One, for which the gaming media outlets tried to get in contact with indie developers, including people like Phil Fish and Jonathan Blow. Both Phil and John were seemingly unwilling to provide any comment on it, so Marcus Beer had this to say about them.
Gents, you were the guys who did Indie Games the movie, and some of you looked relatively normal in it. One of you looked like a total tosspot in it. But you can't have it both ways. You're successful game designers. You're indie game designers. Hurrah, good for you, you fucking hipsters.
Phil would post a lot of tweets about these comments following the podcast's release, attacking Marcus Beer and eventually concluding with the announcement that, I'm done. FEZ 2 is cancelled. Goodbye. To be clear, I'm not cancelling FEZ 2 because some boorish fuck said something stupid. I'm doing it to get out of games. And I'm getting out of games because I choose not to put up with this abuse anymore. Soon after, he would famously make this post on the Polytron blog. FEZ 2 is cancelled. I am done. I take the money and I run. This is as much as I can stomach. This isn't the result of any one thing, but the end of a long, bloody campaign. You win. though FEZ would continue to be ported to new systems over the next several years, and Polytron would go on to help publish games in the future. This was the end of Phil Fish, the public figure, and the end of the FEZ IP. His Twitter account would go private, only resurfacing every April Fool's Day to say that FEZ 2 is back on. But FEZ 2 was never really meant to be, and that's the case for two different reasons. The first of these is that Phil would later confirm that FEZ 2 was announced around the same time that pre-production began on the game. Polytron had hardly begun to even sketch ideas for what the sequel would be, so canceling it really only undid a month's worth of preliminary work. This is despite Phil stating previously that his biggest regret around FEZ was how early into its development he had announced it, which led to the rising pressure from fans and the money problems Polytron faced during development. Based on this, it's entirely possible that the intention was always to cancel the game, which unfortunately would only feel punishing to those who had genuine interest in FEZ, and not just the rage baiters that pushed things to this point. Speaking of which, the more important reason that FEZ 2 wouldn't realistically happen is that Phil Fish's personality is just a brutal catch-22 of self-destruction, a ticking time bomb that would inevitably reach the end of its fuse and destroy whatever good could have come out of the FEZ IP. Phil had an excellent marketing strategy for FEZ that helped it to reach so many people over the years, but by putting himself and his work in the spotlight and opening himself up to criticism in this way, his difficulties with handling that negativity grew more pronounced. This type of personality will inevitably self-sabotage if it becomes successful enough in the online realm, where engagement with the audience is much more normalized and encouraged. Though it's easy to see Phil's characterization of these growing voices of dissent as a long, bloody campaign as melodramatic on his part, I do think it's how he understood that criticism within his own mind. I just don't think he could see it any other way, and that's why he deemed it necessary to fight back. For what it's worth, he made what was likely the best decision for himself in this circumstance, which was to totally distance himself from Twitter and the internet in general. Phil Fish would remain in the industry in a significantly more private manner to help publish the VR version of Super Hypercube alongside Kokoromi and another game called Panoramical, but he would never publicly touch FEZ again outside of setting up future ports like the iOS and Switch versions. Renaud Bedard continued to work on minor patches for FEZ's PC version in his free time, though he went on to work at Capybara Games around the time of FEZ's release on PC. Everyone else involved with the brief preliminary development of FEZ 2 was surprised by Phil's decision to cancel the game, but they were understanding of his perspective and would either continue to help Polytron with publishing and future FEZ ports, or they amicably separated from the company. Unless you want to theorize on whether or not Phil continued to work on the sequel in secret afterwards, the cancellation of FEZ 2 and Phil's departure from game development as a whole was the official death of FEZ. But thankfully, FEZ itself made it across the finish line, and it's been immortalized through a string of ports to modern hardware that has kept the game easily playable for over a decade. In some ways, the character and behavior of Phil Fish has overshadowed FEZ as a game in certain niches around the internet, but it continues to be greatly appreciated as a cult classic for those interested in its unsolvable mysteries. Those deepest mysteries haven't really come up in this story so far, mostly because they were always meant to be a surprise hidden at the lowest layer of FEZ's progression. Marketing the existence of these deeper puzzles widely just didn't make sense, especially since the rotation mechanic and the game's general visual polish made a much more intuitive connection with a wider audience. The more cryptic side of FEZ, involving alternate languages and secret codes, seems to be a development that first emerged around the first development reset in 2008, since this is around when the concept for the Zooish language first appeared. The Zooish numbers and the idea of centering a large chunk of the game around secret puzzle solving came about alongside the final soft development reset in the summer of 2010, though the exact point at which things like the Tetramino codes were first developed is unclear based on public records. Additionally, given Polytron company policy around the monolith and similar mysteries being no comment, it's no surprise that we don't have any idea of when these iconic aspects of the game were planned or implemented. But while looking into this story hasn't given any direct information about these mysteries, I think it's perfectly reasonable to conclude that, although the monolith itself may have been unintentionally brilliant, the rest of the game is far from unintentional. Phil Fish is a perfectionist, and he took far longer to create FEZ than he ever wanted to because he couldn't allow the game to fall short of his artistic vision. So it's funny, and also a little bit awe-inspiring, that FEZ would only become so much greater than the sum of its already excellent parts because of a happy accident. Realistically, no artist will be able to have full control over their own work at all times. The creation of art is not free from the human tendency to make mistakes, introducing flaws that can grow out of control when given enough time to fester. It's rare that these mistakes actually make a positive impact, especially not when as defining to how a work is remembered today as the monolith is for FEZ, and I think that can be just as beautiful as the skilled craftsmanship of a masterful artist. This is, much more than the search for answers in the unanswerable, what has caused me to return to thinking about FEZ again and again for the past 7 years, and I hope I'll continue to think about it for many years to come.